Chapter 5 of The Jewel of Seven Stars. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker. Chapter 5. More Strange Instructions. When I came from my room at 11:30 o'clock, I found all well in the sick room. The new nurse, prim, neat, and watchful, sat in the chair by the bedside where Nurse Kennedy had sat last night. A little way off, between the bed and the safe, sat Dr. Winchester, alert and wakeful, but looking strange and almost comic with the respirator over mouth and nose. As I stood in the doorway looking at them, I heard a slight sound. Turning round, I saw the new detective, who nodded, held up the finger of silence, and withdrew quietly. Hitherto no one of the watchers was overcome by sleep. I took a chair outside the door. As yet there was no need for me to risk coming again under the subtle influence of last night. Naturally my thoughts went revolving round the main incidents of the last day and night, and I found myself arriving at strange conclusions, doubts, conjectures. But I did not lose myself, as on last night, in trains of thought. The sense of the present was ever with me, and I really felt as should a sentry on guard. Thinking is not a slow process, and when it is earnest the time can pass quickly. It seemed a very short time indeed till the door, usually left ajar, was pulled open, and Dr. Winchester emerged, taking off his respirator as he came. His act, when he had it off, was demonstrative of his keenness. He turned up the outside of the wrap and smelled it carefully. "I am going now," he said. "I shall come early in the morning, unless of course I am sent for before. But all seems well tonight." The next to appear was Sergeant Daw, who went quietly into the room and took the seat vacated by the doctor. I still remained outside, but every few minutes looked into the room. This was rather a form than a matter of utility, for the room was so dark that coming even from the dimly lighted corridor it was hard to distinguish anything. A little before 12 o'clock Miss Trelawny came from her room. Before coming to her father's, she went into that occupied by Nurse Kennedy. After a couple of minutes she came out, looking, I thought, a trifle more cheerful. She had her respirator in her hand, but before putting it on, asked me if anything special had occurred since she had gone to lie down. I answered in a whisper, there was no loud talking in the house tonight, that all was safe, was well. She then put on her respirator, and I mine, and we entered the room. The detective and the nurse rose up, and we took their places. Sergeant Daw was the last to go out. He closed the door behind him as we had arranged. For a while I sat quiet, my heart beating. The place was grimly dark. The only light was a faint one from the top of the lamp which threw a white circle on the high ceiling, except the emerald sheen of the shade as the light took its under edges. Even the light only seemed to emphasize the blackness of the shadows. These presently began to seem, as on last night, to have a sentience of their own. I did not myself feel in the least sleepy, and each time I went softly over to look at the patient, which I did about every 10 minutes, I could see that Miss Trelawny was keenly alert. Every quarter of an hour one or other of the policemen looked in through the partly open door. Each time both Miss Trelawny and I said through our mufflers, "All right," and the door was closed again. As the time wore on, the silence and the darkness seemed to increase. The circle of light on the ceiling was still there, but it seemed less brilliant than at first. The green edging of the lampshade became like Maori greenstone rather than emerald. The sounds of the night without the house, and the starlight spreading pale lines along the edges of the window cases, made the pall of black within more solemn and more mysterious. We heard the clock in the corridor chiming the quarters with its silver bell till 2 o'clock, and then a strange feeling came over me. I could see from Miss Trelawny's movement as she looked around that she also had some new sensation. The new detective had just looked in. We two were alone with the unconscious patient for another quarter of an hour. My heart began to beat wildly. There was a sense of fear over me. Not for myself; my fear was impersonal. It seemed as though some new person had entered the room, and that a strong intelligence was awake close to me. Something brushed against my leg. I put my hand down hastily and touched the furry coat of Silvio. With a very faint far-away sound of a snarl he turned and scratched at me. I felt blood on my hand. I rose gently and came over to the bedside. Miss Trelawny, too, had stood up and was looking behind her, as though there was something close to her. Her eyes were wild, and her breast rose and fell as though she were fighting for air. When I touched her she did not seem to feel me. She worked her hands in front of her, as though she was fending off something. There was not an instant to lose. I seized her in my arms and rushed over to the door, threw it open, and strode into the passage, calling loudly: "Help! Help!" In an instant the two detectives, Mrs. Grant, and the nurse appeared on the scene. Close on their heels came several of the servants, both men and women. Immediately Mrs. Grant came near enough, I placed Miss Trelawny in her arms and rushed back into the room, turning up the electric light as soon as I could lay my hand on it. Sergeant Daw and the nurse followed me. We were just in time. Close under the great safe, where on the 2 successive nights he had been found, lay Mr. Trelawny, with his left arm, bare save for the bandages, stretched out. Close by his side was a leaf-shaped Egyptian knife, which had lain amongst the curios on the shelf of the broken cabinet. Its point was stuck in the parquet floor, whence had been removed the blood-stained rug. But there was no sign of disturbance anywhere, nor any sign of anyone or anything unusual. The policeman and I searched the room accurately, whilst the nurse and 2 of the servants lifted the wounded man back to bed, but no sign or clue could we get. Very soon Miss Trelawny returned to the room. She was pale but collected. When she came close to me, she said in a low voice: "I felt myself fainting. I did not know why, but I was afraid." The only other shock I had was when Miss Trelawny cried out to me, as I placed my hand on the bed, to lean over and look carefully at her father. "You are wounded! Look! Look, your hand is bloody! There is blood on the sheets!" I had, in the excitement, quite forgotten Silvio's scratch. As I looked at it, the recollection came back to me; but before I could say a word, Miss Trelawny had caught hold of my hand and lifted it up. When she saw the parallel lines of the cuts she cried out again: "It is the same wound as Father's!" Then she laid my hand down gently but quickly, and said to me and to Sergeant Daw: "Come to my room. Silvio is there in his basket." We followed her, and found Silvio sitting in his basket, awake. He was licking his paws. The detective said: "He is there, sure enough; but why licking his paws?" Margaret, Miss Trelawny, gave a moan as she bent over and took one of the forepaws in her hand; but the cat seemed to resent it, and snarled. At that Mrs. Grant came into the room. When she saw that we were looking at the cat, she said: "The nurse tells me that Silvio was asleep on Nurse Kennedy's bed ever since you went to your Father's room until a while ago. He came there